Building a castle wasn't like putting together a simple wooden shelf. There were no do-overs, and a single mistake didn't mean a wobbly structure. It meant several tons of stone collapsing on your skull. Kings learned this the hard way, usually right after someone confidently declared, "That should hold." Medieval kings were the original property experts, and they weren't just looking for good school districts when it came to building castles. Picking the right spot was like a deadly serious game of Monopoly. Get it wrong, and you might lose more than just your money. Kings couldn't just point at a map and say, "Put my castle there." They needed a spot that would keep them safe, well supplied, and powerful. It was like choosing where to sit in a classroom. You want to see everything that's going on, have easy access to the door, and maybe be close enough to borrow a pencil when you need one. Except instead of pencils, you're protecting yourself from armies trying to kill you. High ground was the medieval equivalent of penthouse living. From up high, you could spot enemies coming from miles away, giving you plenty of time to prepare your defenses. Plus, attacking uphill is exhausting. Try running up a steep hill while carrying heavy weapons and armor. I once tried hiking uphill with just a backpack, and I felt like I was dying. Now, imagine doing that while people are shooting arrows at you. Water sources were crucial, too. Medieval kings weren't just thinking about staying hydrated, though. That, of course, was important. Rivers and lakes acted as natural moats, making it harder for enemies to attack. They also provided fresh water for drinking, cooking, and cleaning. Because, trust me, nobody wants to live in a castle that smells like unwashed socks. Recent archaeological studies have shown that some castles had ingenious water management systems, including underground cisterns that could store enough water to support hundreds of people for months during a siege. Being close to major roads and trade routes was like having your castle next to a medieval highway. You needed supplies coming in regularly: food, weapons, building materials, and all the other things that keep a castle running. It's similar to how modern cities grow around major transportation routes, except instead of Amazon deliveries, you're getting cartloads of grain and iron. Sometimes the perfect spot for a castle already had people living there. Imagine having to tell a whole village, "Hey, sorry folks, but the king wants this hill for his new castle. Time to pack up and move." It's like when your older sibling claims the best spot on the couch, except on a much larger scale. Historical records show that some medieval kings would relocate entire communities of up to 1,000 people just to build their castles. Talk about an extreme version of eminent domain. And get this, sometimes they'd even move entire churches. Imagine trying to explain that one to the Pope. "Yes, Your Holiness, we're just repositioning your church." No big deal. Securing the perfect location wasn't just about the physical aspects. Kings had to navigate a complex web of politics, property rights, and feudal obligations. It was like playing chess, Risk, and SimCity all at once. One wrong move could start a war or trigger a peasant revolt. In fact, there are documented cases of castle construction projects being abandoned halfway through because of political disputes. Sometimes, kings would sweeten the deal for displaced locals, offering them alternative land, tax breaks, or other perks. It's like when your parents buy you ice cream after making you clean your room, except the room is your entire village. And the ice cream is, well, probably still not worth it. One particularly clever king in the 12th century offered lifetime positions in his castle staff to the leaders of a displaced village. Talk about a medieval career change. The really smart kings would pick spots that had symbolic meaning. To building a castle on the site of an ancient battlefield or holy ground was like medieval PR. It sent a message about power and legitimacy. Like how modern politicians love to make speeches at historic locations with more dungeons and drawbridges, some castles were even built on sites that had local legends or myths attached to them, adding an extra layer of supernatural intimidation to their already imposing presence. Defensive considerations could get pretty creative, too. Some kings would choose locations that looked terrible at first glance but had hidden advantages, like building near a swamp. Sure, it smelled bad, but try moving siege equipment through marshland. One famous castle in Wales was built with 3 sides facing steep cliffs, making it practically impossible to attack from those directions. Talk about working smarter, not harder. Some castle locations were chosen based on astronomical alignments. Certain medieval builders would position castles so that the sun would shine directly through specific windows on important dates, like the king's birthday or religious festivals. Medieval bling at its finest. Of course, once you've picked the perfect spot, you've only solved the first piece of the puzzle. Now comes the really fun part, gathering all the materials needed to build this massive stone fortress. And when I say fun, I mean a logistical nightmare that would make modern construction projects look like building with Legos. Just imagine trying to move thousands of tons of stone without truck, cranes, or even proper roads. In fact, the amount of stone needed for a typical castle's foundation alone could fill about 50 modern swimming pools, and that's just the beginning of the material gathering adventure. You'd think it would be as simple as ordering from medieval Amazon Prime, but no such luck. We're talking about moving thousands of tons of stone without trucks, cranes, or even decent roads. Makes you appreciate modern construction equipment, doesn't it? Let's talk numbers for a second. A typical medium-sized castle needed about 12,000 tons of stone. To put that in perspective, that's the weight of about 2,000 elephants. The biggest castles could use up to 50,000 tons, basically a small mountain's worth of rock. And you thought moving your couch was hard. Recent archaeological studies have shown that some of the larger castles in Wales used stone blocks weighing up to 1.5 tons each. That's heavier than a modern car. The closest quarry wasn't always next door either. Sometimes, the good stone was miles away, which meant organizing the medieval equivalent of a cross-country moving company. They'd create temporary wooden roads just to handle the weight of the stone blocks. These roads were actually pretty clever. They'd lay down thick wooden planks and regularly replace them as they wore out, kind of like a medieval version of highway maintenance. Except, instead of orange cones, they probably just had a guy with a flag saying, "Hey, watch out for the giant rocks." Transportation was a whole circus act in itself. Oxen were the medieval equivalent of semi-trucks, except way slower and with more attitude problems. A team of oxen could pull about 2 tons of stone at once, moving at the blazing speed of 2 miles per hour. At that rate, if the quarry was 10 miles away, you'd spend an entire day just making one round trip. Records from one castle build show they needed 200 oxen, working continuously for 3 years just to transport the stone. Some clever builders used rivers when they could, floating stone downstream on barges. It was like the medieval version of prime shipping, faster and easier than land transport. Of course, this only worked if you were lucky enough to have a river between your quarry and your building site. Otherwise, it was back to the Oxen Express. But stone wasn't the only material they needed. Wood was just as important. They needed tons of it for scaffolding, roofs, doors, and temporary structures during construction. Records from one castle build show they used over 3,000 trees just for scaffolding. Imagine being the guy in charge of counting all those trees. Medieval deforestation was so severe that some areas of England still haven't fully recovered their woodland. 800 years later, the wood situation got so bad in some areas that they had special laws about cutting down trees. Some kings would declare entire forests off limits to everyone except castle builders. Breaking these laws could get you in serious trouble, like spending the rest of your life in the dungeon you helped build. Kind of trouble. Then there was the issue of skilled labor. Master stonemasons were like the rock stars of the medieval construction world. Kings would actually fight over the best builders, offering them special privileges and fat paychecks. Some masons became so famous they could demand ridiculous perks. One master mason reportedly insisted on being paid partly in wine, specifying exactly which vineyards it had to come from. Talk about medieval workplace benefits. The actual workforce was massive. Historical records show that some castle builds employed over 1,000 workers at peak construction. You had specialized stonecutters, carpenters, blacksmiths, and general laborers. Each group had their own guild rules, pay scales, and working conditions. Managing all these workers was like herding cats. Of cats wore medieval work boots and argued about lunch breaks. Speaking of workers, let's talk about the unsung heroes of castle construction, the rope makers. These folks literally held everything together. A major castle build could use several miles of rope for hauling stones and operating pulleys. The rope had to be incredibly strong and regularly replaced. One castle's account showed they went through enough rope in a year to stretch from London to Paris. The most surprising material they used, iron. They needed tons of it for tools, nails, hinges, and other metalwork. A large castle might use up to 50 tons of iron, and this was at a time when iron was worth its weight in silver. Quality control was another headache. Stone blocks had to be cut to exact specifications. Workers developed sophisticated techniques for testing stone quality. Some would even lick the stones to check for impurities. Not the most hygienic method, but hey, whatever works. They also had to check wood for rot and iron for impurities. One wrong material could bring down an entire wall. Finally, there was the storage challenge. Medieval builders had to keep their materials organized and protected from the elements. They built temporary shelters for storing tools and materials, which sometimes ended up being almost as big as the castle itself. It was like having a medieval Home Depot right on site. Now that the foundations were set and the materials were gathered, the real test began, transforming that mountain of stone into something that could withstand centuries of siege, storms, and time itself. It was no easy feat. Medieval builders had no modern equipment, no mechanical cranes or electric drills. They had their hands, their wits, and a profound understanding of the natural world. The result, some of the most astonishing feats of engineering ever conceived castles that still stand today, even in ruin, whispering stories of the men and women who built them. Laying the foundation wasn't just a matter of digging a hole and filling it with rock. No, the foundation had to be something solid, something that could hold the weight of a massive stone fortress. Builders would dig deep, sometimes as much as 40 feet down, until they hit solid bedrock, like digging down to the bones of the earth itself. One castle in Wales had foundations that went as deep as 65 feet. That's deeper than a 3-story house is tall. And once they had their trench, the next step was to fill it not with any old rocks, but with carefully selected stones, layered like the pages of a great book, each layer adding to the story of the castle's strength. They used a mixture called mortara, mix of lime, sand, and water. But some builders got creative with their recipe. Some would add animal blood to make it stronger. Others threw in egg whites, hair, or even beer. Yes, beer. The medieval castle, it seems, was built on one of history's strangest smoothies. But this mortar wasn't just a glue. It had to bond the massive stones together so tightly that even centuries later, the foundation would remain intact. To ensure this, builders used a technique called stepped foundations, massive, pyramid-like structures that grew wider as they went deeper, spreading the weight of the castle evenly and ensuring it wouldn't collapse under its own mass. Archaeologists have studied these foundations and discovered that some of the most remarkable examples were so precise. They could have been built with modern surveying tools. But, of course, they weren't. The builders relied on something simpler: plumb lines, wooden frames, and their own keen sense of space and geometry. And some castles were so perfectly aligned that modern engineers still marvel at the precision. A foundation, hundreds of feet long, might be off by just a few inches. Today, that's the kind of precision you'd expect from laser-guided machines, not men with chisels and a steady hand. Once the foundation was set, they had to build upward, and that's where the real creativity began. The walls were the spine of the castle, tall, thick, and impervious to everything from battering rams to arrows. A typical castle wall could stand 30 to 45 feet high, but the most impressive walls, like those at Carnarvon Castle in Wales, soared to over 80 feet, and the thickness, sometimes, the walls were 20 feet thick at the base. They weren't just stone walls. They were fortresses unto themselves. Building these walls wasn't as simple as stacking stone after stone. No, the stonework was a carefully planned process. Each layer of stone was carefully cut, then placed with precision, making sure each one fit together like pieces of an ancient puzzle. Some stones were cut so precisely that, even today, you can't slip a credit card between them. This was no accident. This was the work of master stonemasons, men whose skill was so renowned that kings would fight to hire them, offering them perks and privileges few others could dream of. Behind the finely cut stones came layers of rougher rock, held together by mortar, and in the middle, the heart of the wall rubble filled mixture of smaller stones, leftover chips from cutting the larger blocks, and sometimes odd materials like old tools, broken pottery, and, occasionally, a worker's lunch. These walls were a mosaic of history, a literal patchwork of the past, and the mortar that bound them wasn't just a building material, it was a record, telling the story of what came before. Getting those massive stones into place was an operation that would make modern construction sites look like child's play. Builders used wooden cranes, or windlasses, essentially giant medieval elevators powered by human labor. Workers would walk inside large wooden wheels, turning them to lift stones, weighing up to 2 tons, about the weight of a modern car. Imagine pushing the limits of human strength just to move a single block of stone. And these blocks weren't just haphazardly thrown into place. Builders carefully designed walls with a slight slope, wider at the bottom and narrower at the top. This wasn't an aesthetic choice, it was a defensive one. The slope made the wall stronger and helped deflect missiles. Inside the walls, things were just as ingenious. Many castles were designed with hidden passages, secret corridors woven into the very fabric of the walls themselves. These weren't just for dramatic escapes or secret meetings. These hidden routes were used to move supplies, send messages, and even spy on visitors. One castle in France had so many secret passages that a guard got lost in them for 2 days. Modern surveys have shown some castles had miles of these hidden routes, winding through walls and under floors, often without leaving a trace. But it wasn't all about secret rooms and defensive strategies. Castles were symbols of power, and the builders knew that. They didn't just construct walls. They constructed statements. Some castles were built with astronomical alignments in mind. Builders would position towers and windows so that on certain dates, like the king's birthday or a religious festival, the sun would shine directly through specific windows, filling the castle with light and symbolizing divine approval. But the towers, those were the crown jewels of a castle's defense. More than just decorative structures, towers were designed to withstand the brutal realities of medieval warfare. Round towers, in particular, were preferred because tests have shown they were 50% more likely to survive bombardment than their square counterparts. No corners meant no places for attackers to hide. And within those towers, there were staircases, spiral staircases that turned clockwise. This wasn't for consistency's sake. It was a clever defensive feature. Most people were right, so attackers coming up the stairs would find it harder to swing a sword, as their right arm would be pressed against the wall. Defenders coming down had all the room they needed to fight back. These towers weren't just for defense, though they were the ultimate sign of a king's power. Inside the towers, chambers for royalty, rooms for soldiers, and places for visitors were all meticulously arranged. And the gatehouse, the castle's first line of defense, was the most heavily fortified part of the structure. If the gatehouse fell, the entire castle could fall with it. That's why it was often the last part of the castle to be finished, guarded by the thickest, strongest walls. The reality of medieval castle construction wasn't just about stone and mortar. It was about the people who built them. The laborers, the stonemasons, the rope makers, and even the oxen that hauled the stone blocks. They were all part of something larger than themselves. They were part of a legacy, a monumental achievement that would, in many cases, outlast their own lifetimes. These castles were not just fortresses. They were monuments to the ambition, the genius, and sometimes the cruelty of the men who built them. It's easy to look at these castles and see them as relics of the past, crumbling stone structures that stand as silent witnesses to centuries of history. But when you look closer, you begin to see the complexity, the ingenuity, and the sacrifice that went into their creation. These were not just buildings. They were living, breathing embodiments of the medieval world, full of stories and secrets, still whispering their truths to those who are willing to listen. And yet, as impressive as the walls and towers were, the most remarkable thing about medieval castles was not their physical size or strength. It was the idea they represented, an idea of power, of control, of permanence in a world that was constantly shifting. To stand atop a castle tower was to look down upon the world below, to see not just land and people, but history itself unfolding. These castles were the backbone of medieval society, the centerpieces of kingdoms, and the embodiment of kings' hopes, fears, and aspirations. But there's always more beneath the surface. Always another layer to peel back. Because, as we'll see, the secrets of castle construction aren't just in the stone, they're in the stories they still hold, waiting to be uncovered. Now that the walls were built, the towers constructed, and the gatehouses fortified, the true test of a castle's resilience was about to begin. The greatest threat wasn't just time or neglect, it was warfare. The art of defending a medieval castle was a deadly, ever-evolving science, one that combined the ingenuity of architects with the brutality of armies. Siege warfare was the ultimate crucible for these fortresses, and it was a battle of minds as much as it was of strength. If you wanted to breach a castle, it wasn't enough to simply show up with a battering ram and a few siege towers. You had to contend with layers of defenses that were as complex as they were deadly. And these defenses weren't just physical, they were psychological. One of the most iconic features of any medieval castle was its massive gates. These weren't your typical wooden doors. They were fortresses unto themselves, made of thick timber, sometimes reinforced with iron, and often covered in metal plates. The gates were the very heart of the castle's defense. But it wasn't just about strength. A well-designed gatehouse had multiple layers of protection. First came the heavy wooden doors, then came the drawbridge, which could be raised to cut off access entirely. Behind that, you had the portcullis, heavy iron grill that could be dropped to seal off the entrance completely. And if that wasn't enough, there was usually a killing zone between the two gates, a trap that could be filled with boiling oil, arrows, or even rocks. This gateway was, in effect, a fortress within a fortress. But it wasn't just the gates that made castle defense so formidable. The entire structure was designed with survival in mind. Take the walls, for example. They weren't just tall, were wide, often 10 to 20 feet thick at the base, tapering slightly as they rose. This made them resistant to impact, especially from siege weapons like battering rams. Some castles, especially those on high ground, had walls that were so steep that attackers couldn't even get close without exhausting themselves. A steep slope, coupled with strategic positioning, made it nearly impossible for enemy troops to launch a direct assault. And then there were the towers, the castle's true sentinels. These structures were not only designed to provide a commanding view of the surrounding land, but also to be virtually impregnable. A well-placed round tower, as mentioned before, could withstand bombardment better than any other shape. Round towers, unlike square ones, had no corners, no weak points. They were designed to absorb and deflect the impact of any weapon, from arrows to trebuchet stones, making them the perfect defense against long-range attacks. The walls of these towers were sometimes up to 20 feet thick, built to endure the strain of a prolonged siege. Inside these towers, the defenders had several tricks up their sleeves. Arrow slits, narrow openings in the walls were strategically placed to allow archers to shoot at attackers from relative safety. And these weren't just your standard vertical slits. Some of them had a unique design. They were wider on the inside than the outside. This created an angled view, allowing archers to shoot at enemies across a much larger arc. In fact, Tests with modern replicas of these arrow loops have shown that archers could cover a 70-degree angle of fire through a single slit, a perfect, deadly shot, aimed at anyone daring enough to approach. But even the best defenses could be overcome with the right tools. This is where siege weapons came into play. The most feared of these was the Trebuchet, a massive, mechanical weapon capable of launching huge stones, flaming projectiles, or even dead animals into the castle. With its counterweight design, a trebuchet could hurl objects at incredible distances, shaking the very foundations of the castle. And then there was the battering ram, designed to smash through gates and walls. Some were covered in thick metal to protect the attackers from arrows, while others were suspended from a frame and swung like a pendulum. Despite all the ingenuity poured into castle defenses, the reality was that no structure, no matter how well built, could stand forever. Time and the constant pressure of warfare would eventually take its toll. But medieval castles weren't just fortresses of stone. They were also hubs of culture, wealth, and power. Inside, the walls would have been adorned with tapestries and paintings, rich with the history of the family or lord who ruled within them. Kings and queens would have dined in lavish halls, with their subjects and guests listening to minstrels, the clinking of goblets mixing with the sound of laughter. Castles were not just fortifications, they were homes, courts, and symbols of authority. The evolution of castles didn't stop at their defense. As the centuries passed, builders began to refine their designs. The early medieval castles, often simple Matamballi structures, were replaced with more complex stone fortresses. The keep, the central tower of a castle, became the focal point of the entire structure. These keeps were not just strongholds, they were symbols of the lord's power, often towering above the rest of the castle in a display of dominance. But even these grand keeps couldn't escape the passage of time. As the art of siege warfare evolved, so too did the need for more elaborate defensive measures. It was during this time that we began to see the rise of the concentric castle. These were castles within castles, designed with multiple layers of defense. The outer walls would protect the inner courtyard, which in turn would guard the keep itself. It was an evolution of the layered defense strategy, designed to give defenders a better chance of holding out against a long siege. Inside these concentric castles, defenders had a distinct advantage. A series of defensive walls created a maze of barriers, meaning attackers had to breach multiple levels before they could even think about reaching the heart of the castle. And while attackers were working their way through these barriers, the defenders were already making plans for a counterattack. Some castles even had secret tunnels leading to nearby rivers, allowing the defenders to escape or send messages in times of danger. But even with these advanced features, no castle was ever truly safe. In the end, the only thing that could guarantee the survival of a castle was the will of its defenders. And this was where the human element came into play. A castle could have all the walls and towers in the world, but if the people inside weren't prepared, if they didn't have the resolve to endure a siege, all those defenses would be meaningless. It was during times of peace that castles transformed once again, from fortresses to symbols of status and luxury. Some kings and nobles even transformed their castles into magnificent palaces, complete with gardens, grand halls, and expansive chambers. The brutal, military focus of earlier times gave way to art and culture, and these castles became the setting for royal gatherings, feasts, and festivals. It's as if the castles themselves were breathing a sigh of relief after centuries of battle. Yet in the silence of these grand halls, there are still echoes of the past, whispers of the countless sieges, the countless lives that were spent defending these fortresses, and the kingdoms that rose and fell within their walls. The stone, though weathered and crumbled, still carries the weight of history's stories of ambition, warfare, and survival. Today, when we visit these castles, we're walking through the ruins of a past long gone. But in those quiet, forgotten corners, we can still feel the presence of the past, the lives of those who once lived, fought, and dreamed within these walls. And, if we listen closely enough, we may hear the whispers of secrets hidden beneath the stones, secrets that time has yet to reveal. These castles were not just monuments to military might, they were the keepers of history itself. And in some way, they still are. The stories of the kings, the knights, the builders, and the warriors who once called these places home live on in the walls, the towers, and the foundations they left behind. As we look back on these monumental achievements, we realize that the true legacy of these castles is not just in their stones and mortars. It's in the ingenuity, the spirit, and the stories that live on within them, stories that continue to captivate our imagination, and secrets that continue to await discovery. And perhaps, in some way, that's the true beauty of these fortresses. They are not just remnants of the past, they are living, breathing echoes of history, still speaking to us from beyond the centuries. Asterisk, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment below. See you in the next one.